I have shot men who deserved it and buried a few who probably didn't, and I've never once lost sleep over the arithmetic. But there's a woman in a town I won't name, a town so small it doesn't even bother lying about what it is, and I still keep her tally in the back of my ledger. Not the money she owed. The bruises. I counted them the way a man counts change he's owed, because for the longest time that was all anyone in that place would let her be. A thing to be mocked, a thing to be pitied, a thing to be looked past. They laughed at her in the street. I heard it. I did nothing at first because doing nothing was the only trade I was ever any good at. And then one cold morning, I saw what was really under those bruises, and I understood that the whole town had been reading the wrong story off her skin. This is that story. Every word of it cost me something. The first time I saw Naya Rays, she was picking herself up out of the mud outside the mercantile, and half of Coldwater was laughing. I want to be honest about that, because if I dress it up any prettier than it was, the rest of this won't mean anything. I sat my horse at the end of the street with my hat low and my coat buttoned against a wind that came down off the Chiricahuas like it had a grudge, and I watched a grown woman go down hard on her knees in front of a dozen people, and not one of them moved to help her, including me. I told myself I was a stranger. I told myself it was none of my affair. A man tells himself a great many things when he doesn't want to get down off his horse. She was Apache, or half of one, I'd learn later, though in Coldwater the distinction wasn't one anybody troubled to make. Her mother's people had been Chiricahua, run off the land north of the Gila back before I was old enough to shave, and her father had been a Sonoran freighter who died of a fever the way freighters generally did, quiet and far from home. That left Naya somewhere between two worlds that both had reasons to shut the door on her. Coldwater had decided which reasons it liked best. "Get up, squaw," a man called from the boardwalk, and there was that laughter again, easy and warm, the laughter of people comfortable in their meanness. She got up. That was the first thing about her that lodged in me like a splinter. She got up without hurrying, without looking at any of them, wiping the mud from her palms onto the front of a dress that had been patched so many times it was more thread than cloth. On her left cheekbone was a bruise the color of a storm 3 days old, yellow going green at the edges. On her wrist, when the sleeve fell back, was another. I noticed them the way I notice most things. It's a habit I can't shut off. You should know that about me before we go further. My name doesn't matter much, and I've worn 3 or 4 of them, but folks who have heard of me call me the counting man, and they don't mean it kindly. I keep a ledger. A little leather book, sweat dark at the corners, that I've carried since a war I'd rather not name. In it I write things down. Not thoughts, I'm no diarist, but counts. Miles, dollars, days since rain, the number of men I've faced across a stretch of dirt, and beside each of those a small notation only I can read. Some men pray, I tally. It keeps the world orderly when the world is anything but, and it keeps my hands busy when they'd rather do something I'd regret. I wrote her down that first day. Not her name, I didn't have it yet. Just Coldwater, woman, 2 bruises visible, nobody helps. And under it, out of an honesty I didn't much enjoy inkle me. I'd ridden into Coldwater for the simplest reason a man like me ever has won. I was tired, my horse was tireder, and a town, even a mean one, has oats and a roof and whiskey. I meant to stay a night. Maybe 2 if the whiskey was any good. I had no intention of learning anybody's story. I'd made a whole life out of not learning them. The saloon was called the Lucky Strike, which was a joke, because nobody in Coldwater had ever been lucky, and the strike that gave the town its name had played out a decade back, leaving behind the particular ugliness of a place that used to have money and doesn't anymore. Those towns are the worst. Poverty a man is born to, he can bear. Poverty that came and took something away, that turns people cruel. They go looking for someone lower than themselves, just to prove there's still a bottom to stand on. In Coldwater, Naya Rays was the bottom. They decided it collectively, the way a town decides these things, without a vote, without a word, everyone simply agreeing at once. And they'd built a story to justify it, which is what people always do. The story was this: she was a drunk. She got in fights. Those bruises she wore were her own doing, earned in some gutter, and if she'd only comport herself decent, she wouldn't be a mess of a woman that respectable folks had to step around. The bruises proved she was low. You could see it right there on her face. I heard that story my first evening, told to me unasked by the bartender. A soft, heavy man named Pell who wiped the same clean spot on the bar the entire time he talked. "That Ray's woman," he said, following my gaze to the window where she'd passed carrying a bundle of laundry. "Don't you go feeling sorry. She's trouble. Drinks, fights, no better than she ought to be. Half the men in town have got a story." "That's so," I said. It's a thing I say when I want a man to keep talking without me having to agree with him. Lives out past the wash with old Hobbs, took her in out of Christian charity, and this is the thanks. Comes to town beat all to hell every other week. Pell shook his head at the tragedy of it. Some folks you just can't help. I bought another whiskey and I said nothing, and I wrote in my ledger later upstairs. By the light of a candle, I'd argued the price of story doesn't fit. Because it didn't. I've seen a great many drunks and a great many people who get in fights, and their bruises fall in a particular pattern: knuckles, brow, the outsides of the arms where you throw them up to guard. A fighter's marks are on the fronts and edges of things. Naya Ray's bruises were on the insides, the soft parts. The wrist a hand closes around. The upper arm where fingers dig in. The cheek, yes, but the cheek of someone who wasn't fighting back, someone who was turned away, someone who'd learned that turning away hurt less than facing it. Those aren't a brawler's bruises. Those are a caught animal's. I didn't do anything with that knowledge. I want to keep being honest. I noticed it the way I notice a card counted wrong in another man's game, filed it, moved on, figured it wasn't my table. I'd learned a long time ago that a man who goes around correcting the world's arithmetic ends up dead or worse. So I finished my whiskey and I meant to leave in the morning. The morning is when I met Hobbs. He came into the Lucky Strike loud, the way certain men are always loud, filling a room with themselves before they've said a word. Big through the shoulders, going soft in the middle with a red face and pale eyes and hands like slabs of ham. Everybody greeted him. Everybody liked him, I could see that plain. He bought a round, told a story that got a laugh, clapped Pell on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. A good fellow. A town's kind of man. Christian charity, Pell had said, took her in. I watched Hobbs and I felt something cold move through me that I hadn't felt in a long while, and it wasn't a guess. It was closer to a memory. I'd known men like Hobbs. I'd known exactly one when I was small, and my mother wore his marks in the same soft places until the winter she stopped wearing anything at all. I opened my ledger under the table, and I wrote a single word, and the word was, him. That should have been the end of my not doing. It wasn't, not quite. Understanding a thing and acting on it are two horses, and only one of them was saddled. I'm not a good man. I've never claimed it. I'm a man who's very good at a bad thing, and I've spent most of my life keeping those two facts from getting confused. Getting involved meant unsaddling a lot of careful distance I'd built between myself and everybody else's grief. It meant becoming, once again, a man who cared, and the last time I'd been that man, it had gone about as poorly as a thing can go. So I saddled my actual horse instead. I settled my bill. I rode out to the North Road with every intention of leaving Coldwater to stew in its own meanness the way it plainly preferred to. I made it 4 miles. 4 miles, and there she was on the road ahead of me, walking. Naya Ray's alone, a good hour's walk from town in the wrong direction, carrying nothing, moving with the careful gait of someone whose ribs hurt. When she heard my horse, she went still and then stepped off the road into the scrub, not looking back, making herself small and unremarkable. A woman who had learned that the safest thing to be when a man approaches is invisible. I could have ridden past. God knows I've ridden past worse. I drew up instead, kept my distance, 20 feet more enough that she wouldn't feel cornered. I didn't get down. "Ma'am," I said. She didn't answer, didn't look at me. Up close, the bruise on her cheek was worse than it had seemed across a street, and there was a fresh one at her hairline that the mud yesterday had hidden, and her lower lip was split and had bled and dried and cracked and bled again. She held herself like a fence with a post gone, a structure staying upright out of habit more than sense. "You're a ways from town," I said. "I'm going back," she said. Her voice surprised me. Low, even, with an accent that rolled the edges of the English soft. Not a drunk's voice. Not a broken thing's voice, either. There was steel in it, laid down deep under everything, the way there's rock under a riverbed. "You needn't trouble." "Wasn't going to." That was almost true. "You always walk out this far." For the first time, she looked at me. Dark eyes, and in them a wariness so complete it was almost a kind of peace. The calm of somebody who's already assumed the worst of everyone she'll ever meet and been proven right often enough to stop being surprised. She looked at my coat, my hat, the gun on my hip, the ledger-shaped bulge over my heart. She was taking my measure the way I take everyone's, and I understood in that moment that she was smarter than the whole town of Coldwater put together, and that this was precisely why they hated her. It is a hard thing to be despised by fools. It is a harder thing to be smart enough to know exactly how foolish they are and still be at their mercy. When it's bad, she said, I walk. 3 words about the walking when it's bad. She didn't say what was bad or who made it bad. She didn't have to. I'd already written him down. How far do you get? I asked. Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, that I'd asked the walking question and not the bad question, that I'd stepped around the thing she didn't want to name. Not far enough, she said. There's the wash, and past the wash there's Hobbs's fences, and past the fences there's my mother's country, and I don't have the strength to reach it, and I wouldn't be welcome if I did. She said it plainly, a fact among facts. So I walk until I'm calm and then I go back. Because the walking is the only part that's mine. I have carried a lot of sentences in my life. Most of them I've forgotten. That one I wrote in my ledger that night, word for word, the only full sentence of another person's I've ever bothered to keep. The walking is the only part that's mine. Man named Hobbs, I said, not a question. Her whole body changed, closed. The steel came up over the eyes like a shutter. You'll want to move along, she said, and now the evenness in her voice was a warning. Men who ask about Hobbs cause me grief. He hears, he always hears, and then it's worse. She stepped back toward the road, ready to walk on, ready to be done with me. Whatever you think you're seeing, sir, you're not the first to see it, and the ones before you rode on, and I don't blame them, and I'm asking you to be the same as them. Ride on. It's kinder. She was protecting me from the trouble that helping her would bring. No, that's not it either. She was protecting herself from the false hope of it. She'd been seen before. Seen and pitied and abandoned, because seeing a thing is easy and paying for it is dear. And every man who'd looked at her with understanding in his eyes had eventually ridden on and left the understanding to curdle into one more proof that nobody would ever actually help. My help wasn't a gift to her. It was a threat. Because if I saw and then rode on like the rest, I'd only be one more entry in her ledger of the ones who knew and left. I understood that, and understanding it is the moment I stopped being able to ride on. Not because I'm good, I've said, but because I keep counts and I couldn't stand to be added to that particular tally. It's a small and selfish reason to save a life. It's the true one, and I promised I'd give you the true ones. I'll ride on, I said. Relief, and under it a disappointment so old and worn it barely registered as disappointment anymore. But not today, I said, and swung down off my horse. She flinched at the movement. Every man's movement toward her was a thing to flinch from. And I made myself slow, made myself small the way she'd made herself small in the scrub. And I did the only thing I could think of to prove I was different, which was to reach into my coat and take out the ledger and hold it up where she could see it. You know what folks call me? I said. The counting man. I keep a book. Everything that's owed and everything that's paid and every man I've ever had to stand across a road from. I opened it, turned it so she could see the crabbed columns of figures she couldn't possibly read from 20 feet. I wrote you down yesterday, woman in the mud and nobody helping. I wrote myself down too, right under because I didn't help either and I don't like carrying a debt. I closed the book. I owe you a help, Miss Reyes, just the one. I always settle. Ask anybody who's crossed me, it's the one thing I do. She stared at me for a long moment and I couldn't read her, and that was new for me, not being able to read a person. Then she said, quiet, you don't know what you're offering to pay. No, I admitted, but I'm good for it. Somewhere behind us, faint, from the direction of town, came the sound of a horse. One horse ridden hard. And Nea Reyes went white under the brown of her, white to the lips, and I knew without being told whose horse it was, and I understood that the arithmetic of my whole life was about to change, and I found, to my own considerable surprise, that I wasn't sorry. He always hears, she'd said. He'd heard. Hobbs came up the road at a canter and reined in hard, and his horse, a good bay, better than the man deserved, threw its head against the bit and sidestepped, foam at its mouth. He'd run it. He was the kind of man who'd run a good horse to make a point to a woman on foot. Nea, he said her name like a hook set in a fish. You wandered off. She didn't answer. She'd gone still in that particular way again, the cautanimal stillness, and she'd positioned herself. I noticed this, I notice everything, a half step behind and to the side of me. Not hiding, placing, using me as terrain. A smart creature uses whatever cover the ground provides, and I was the nearest cover, and I felt the strange honor of it settle on me like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. Hobbs looked at me for the first time. Took in the coat, the hat, the gun, and I watched him do the sum that men like him always do. Is this trouble, or is this nothing? And I watched him land, wrongly, on nothing. Because he was a big man liked by a whole town, and I was one dusty stranger on a tired horse, and the powerful are forever making that particular error. It's the only good thing about them. They'll walk right into you because they've never once had to consider that the world might not part. "She give you trouble, mister?" he said, friendly, town-friendly, one reasonable man to another over the head of a foolish woman. "She'll do that. Wanders, simple kind of. I look after her best I can, but you can't watch 'em every minute." He shook his head, sorrowful, and I'll tell you, if I hadn't already known what I knew, he might have fooled me too. He was good. He'd had years of practice being good at the being good. "No trouble," I said. "Well then," he nudged the bay forward a step toward her. "Come on, Naya, home." She didn't move. It was such a small thing, she didn't move. She stood her half-step behind me, and she looked at the ground, and she did not walk toward his horse, and I felt the whole road go tight, because that small refusal cost her more than any of the walking. The walking was hers, she'd said. But this was taking something in front of a witness, and I understood that she'd never dared it before, that my presence had made a door where there'd never been one, and that if I failed her now, she would pay for this refusal in the soft places for a long, long time. Hobbs's friendly face didn't so much change as thin. The warmth stayed pasted on, but something underneath it pulled taut. "Naya," he said, and the hook was in the word again, deeper. "Don't embarrass yourself in front of the gentleman." "I'll see her back," I said. Now he looked at me properly, and the sum ran again, and this time I let him see a little more of the answer, just enough, a stillness of my own, the particular economy of a man who has done this before and isn't in a hurry. "That's a kind offer, stranger," he said, slow, "but she's mine to see to, my charge, legal and moral both." He smiled, and it was a terrible thing to watch a smile try that hard. "You understand, a man's responsible for what's his." "She's not a horse, Hobbs." The name landed on him. He hadn't told it to me. His eyes went to Naya. "You told him, you talked, you'll pay," and I stepped, just slightly, just enough to put myself square in that line of sight, and I said, "I asked in town. Everybody knows Hobbs. Good man, they say, Christian charity." I let that sit. Funny thing about a town, though, everybody agrees on a story so hard and so long that nobody ever checks it. But I'm a checking sort of man. I keep a book. I patted my coat. And the numbers on this woman don't add up to the story I was told. "The hell does that mean?" he said, and the town friendly was mostly gone now. "Means her bruises are in the wrong places for a brawler," I said, conversational, almost gentle. "I've counted a lot of bruises, Hobbs, on other folks and long time ago on somebody I loved. A fighter's marks are on the outsides, the knuckles, the brow, guarding marks. Hers are on the insides, the wrist, the upper arm, the turned-away cheek. Those aren't the marks of a woman who fights." I looked at him. "Those are the marks a woman gets from a man who's bigger than her and knows nobody's counting." The road was very quiet. Even the wind had dropped, the way it does sometimes right before it decides what it's going to do to you. "You calling me something, stranger?" Hobbs said. His hand had drifted, not to a gun. He wasn't a gun man, that was clear. His was the courage that only worked on people who couldn't hit back, but to the coiled quirt at his saddle. A short braided whip. And the sight of that quirt did something to Naya beside me. I heard her breath go shallow and quick, and I understood that she knew that quirt, knew it intimately, and that it lived on his saddle the way my ledger lived over my heart. A tool a man keeps close because he uses it often. I've faced men across a road more times than I've written down, and I've learned there's a moment brief, a heartbeat less, when it's still possible for everyone to ride home. When the thing hasn't happened yet and doesn't have to. Most men blow past that moment without seeing it. It's the most important moment there is, and it's nearly invisible. We were in it. I could feel it, thin as a held breath. "Hobbs," I said, and I kept my voice level and low, offering him the moment, holding the door of it open 1 second longer than I had to, because I am not a good man, but I have grown tired of the other thing, and I wanted, that day, for the arithmetic to come out different than it usually does. "You can turn that horse around. Ride back to town. Naya comes with me, gets her things, and you never see her again, and I never see you. Nobody has to settle anything today. I'll even write it in the book as paid." I meant it. God help me, I meant it. "That's the whole offer. It expires when I stop talking." For a moment, one real moment, I thought he might take it. Something moved behind the pale eyes, some calculation, some flicker of the animal sense that keeps most men alive. He looked at me, and I think, for the first time in a very long time, Hobbs was afraid, and being afraid was so foreign and so intolerable to a man who'd spent years being the biggest thing in every small room he entered that he did what such men always do with fear. He reached for the quirt. "I want to tell you it was a fair fight. It wasn't." It was never going to be. He came off that horse swinging a braided whip at a man who'd been drawing a pistol since before he could grow the mustache, and there is nothing fair about that collision, and I take no pride in it. The quirt caught my raised left forearm and laid it open through the coat. I've still got the mark. A pale see my count sometimes without meaning to. And my right hand did the thing it has always done, quick and terrible, and without any help from the parts of me that might have hesitated, and the road was loud once, and then it was quiet again. Hobbs sat down in the dust, surprised. That's the thing about them, they're always surprised right at the end that the world didn't part. He looked down at himself, and then up at me, and his mouth worked and nothing came out, and then he lay back, slow, almost gentle, the way a man lies down when he's very tired, and the bay horse walked a few steps off and began, unconcerned, to crop the roadside grass. I stood there with a bleeding arm and a smoking gun, and I did not feel the thing I was afraid I'd feel. I'd feared, riding out that morning, that stepping back into caring would break something in me, that I'd feel the old grief crack open. Instead, I felt only a vast and level quiet, the quiet of a column of figures that has finally, after years, come out even. I turned to Naya. She was looking at Hobbs's body with an expression I will spend the rest of my life failing to describe. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't grief. It was something older and stranger than either. The look of a person watching a mountain that has stood over her entire life simply not be there anymore, and finding that the space where it stood is too large to understand all at once. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. And then she made a sound, one sound, low, torn out of somewhere very deep. And it wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a sob. It was the noise a rope makes when a terrible tension comes off it all at once. And she folded down onto her knees in the road not from weakness, but from the sheer unbearable lightness of a weight lifted after too many years of bearing it. I didn't touch her. A man does not touch a creature that spent years being touched wrong. I got down beside her an arm's length off, and I took out my ledger with my good hand, and I opened it to her page, and I found the entry Coldwater. Woman, 2 bruises, nobody helps. Inkle me, and I took my pencil and I drew a single line through it. Paid, I said. She looked at the crossed-out line. She couldn't read the words, but she understood the gesture, the way she understood everything, faster and deeper than the fools who despised her. They won't see it your way, she said finally, and her voice was hoarse, but the steel was back in it, the rock under the riverbed. In town, he was theirs, I'm nothing. They'll say I lured you to it. They'll say the squaw got a man killed. That's the story they'll want, and they'll build it the same way they built the last one, and by winter it'll be true as scripture. She wasn't wrong. I knew she wasn't wrong. You've bought me a grave, mister, and I thank you for it, because it's a better grave than the one I had. And here is where I'd like to tell you I had a plan, that I'd thought it through. I hadn't. I'm a man who counts what's in front of him, and I hadn't counted past the moment on the road, and now the moment was over, and there was a body in the dust and a whole town 4 miles off that would want an accounting, and I looked at Naya Reyes kneeling in the road, alive, free, and utterly out of options, and I understood that the help I'd promised wasn't finished. It had barely started. Killing Hobbs was the easy part. It's always the easy part. That's the terrible secret of my whole trade. The killing is the easy part, and everything that comes after is the bill. We're not going to town, I said. She looked at me. Past the wash, I said, past his fences. You said there's your mother's country beyond, and you said you wouldn't be welcome, and you said you don't have the strength to reach it. I stood, and I put out my good hand, the one that hadn't just done what it did, and I held it there in the air between us, an offer with no hook in it, the first one she'd maybe ever been given. You've got the strength today, and I've got a horse, and I owe you more than one help. Turns out the debt was bigger than I wrote it. So we'll find out together whether they'll have you, and if they won't. I stopped because I didn't have the end of that sentence, and because a man shouldn't promise what he can't count. She looked at my hand for a long, long time. She didn't take my hand. I want that on the record, because it's the truest thing in this whole account, and it taught me more about Naya Reyes than everything before it put together. She looked at my offered hand, the counting man's hand, still warm from the work it had done, and she got to her feet by herself, using no one, the same way she'd gotten up out of the mud on the first day while a town laughed. She'd take the horse. She'd take the road. She would not take being lifted, because being lifted is a thing done to you by someone bigger, and she was finished forever with being at the mercy of anyone's strength but her own. I put my hand away. I understood. I even in some cracked corner of me approved. We didn't go back for her things. There was nothing at Hobbs's place she wanted, and a great deal she never wished to see again, and the only thing she asked to do before we rode was one thing I didn't expect. She walked to Hobbs's body, and she crouched by it. I tensed, not knowing what she meant to do, and she took the quirt, the braided whip, unfastened it from where it hung and held it a moment, that instrument that had lived on his saddle and in her nightmares, and I thought she meant to keep it, or burn it, or beat the dead man with it, and any of those I'd have understood. Instead, she walked to the edge of the road, to the deep cut of the wash below, and she threw it in. Underhand, easy, the way you'd toss a stone you were done skipping. It vanished into the brush at the bottom. It was the loudest thing he owned, she said, coming back. I got tired of listening for it. Then she climbed up behind me on my horse. Behind, not in front, keeping her own hands on the cantle and not on me. A woman who would share a horse but not surrender her balance to a stranger. And we rode north, away from Coldwater into her mother's country. I'll not pretend the country welcomed her with open arms. The world is rarely so tidy, and I promised early on I'd not tie this up neat. The Chiricahua who were left, and there weren't many, scattered and watched and worn down by years of the government's slow cruelty, were wary of me in a way I'd earned on behalf of every white man who'd ever ridden into their country meaning them harm, which was most of us. They had no reason to trust the counting man, and every reason not to. And Nea, half a stranger to them herself, gone since girlhood, carrying a dead man's death behind her and a gunslinger at her side. She was no easy thing for them to place either. There were long days at the edge of their camp. There were counsels I wasn't allowed to hear. There was an old woman, Nea's mother's cousin, who looked at Nea for the better part of an hour without speaking, and then said a single sentence in a language I didn't have. And Nea wept, and I never did learn what the sentence was, and I've decided some accounts aren't mine to keep. But they took her, slow and careful, and with conditions I wasn't party to, but they took her. Because underneath everything, underneath the years and the distance and the bruises, she was her mother's daughter, and blood in that country still meant something the way it had stopped meaning anything back in Coldwater. She had people. It turned out she'd had them the whole time, 4 miles and a wash and a dead man's fences away, close enough to walk to on the bad days and never quite reach. Not far enough, she'd said on the road. She'd been walking toward them for years without knowing it. Me they didn't take, fair enough. I hadn't asked them to. I stayed a week at the edge of things, camped apart, until it was clear she was safe as safe got in a hard world, and then one morning I saddled up to go. There wasn't a place for me there, and we both knew it. A gunslinger doesn't get a home at the end. That's not the story I'm in. I'd made my peace with that a long time back, or thought I had. Nea walked out to see me off. She looked different already, I want to say healed, but that's too easy and too soon. Say instead that she looked like a woman who'd stopped listening for a sound. The wariness was still in her, and I expect it always will be. Some things get written into a person too deep to cross out. But she stood in the morning light with her spine straight and her chin level, and she looked me in the eye, which she hadn't been able to do on the road that first day, and that was healing enough to be going on with. You'll want paying, she said, for the help. It was me owed you, I said. Book square. No, she shook her head, and there was almost something at the corner of her mouth that on another face in another life might have grown into a smile. You keep counts. I've watched you. You crossed out one line, but a man who counts as close as you do doesn't get to call a thing square just because it suits him. You killed a man for me. You made an enemy of a whole town. You rode 4 days out of your way, and you'll ride 4 more back to nothing. That's not one help. That's a debt running the other direction now. She held out her hand. She held out hers, the first time in this whole account that she reached toward another person of her own will, and there was something small in it. So I'm paying. It was a bead. One bead, old, worn smooth, deep blue with a thread of white through it, strung on a bit of sinew. Her mother's, I'd learn later, though she didn't say so then. The old woman had given it to her that first weeping day, one of the conditions I wasn't party to, a token of being claimed. And she was giving it to me. I can't take that, I said, and I meant it, because I understood even without the story what it must be worth. You'll take it, she said, or you'll insult me, and I've been insulted by better men than you. That corner of her mouth again. Put it in your book where you keep the sentence. I went still. What sentence? The one I said on the road. The walking is the only part that's mine. You wrote it down. I saw you. She pressed the bead into my palm and closed my fingers over it with both her hands. The only time she touched me, the whole time I knew her, and she chose it, and that made all the difference in the world. I don't need that sentence anymore, so you keep it and you keep the bead with it, and when you count your dead and your debts and your days since rain, you'll have one thing in the book that's just good, one line that's paid in full both directions. Her voice caught just slightly, just once. Everybody should have one of those, even you, especially you. I rode out of that country with a blue bead in my ledger, and I have carried it ever since. It's there now, pressed against the page where her sentence is written, and I've kept my accounts clean around it. And it's the one entry in the whole book I never had to think about how to tally, because it doesn't owe and it isn't owed. It just is, the way certain rare things get to just be. I never went back to Coldwater. I heard later a man in my trade hears things that the story came out the way she'd said it would. The squaw who got a good man killed, poor Hobbs, Christian charity, and this the thanks. They built it hard and they built it fast, and I've no doubt that by now it's true as scripture in every mouth in that town. Let them have it. A story like that only holds up because everyone agrees not to check it, and I checked it once, and I'm the only accounting that ever mattered, and my book says different. There's a thing I've turned over a great many nights since, and I'll set it down here and then I'll be done, because I've talked longer about this than about anything in my life, and I find I don't want to stop, which is its own kind of confession. The town looked at Naya Rays for years, every day. They saw her bruises up close in the street in the light. They had all the evidence I had and more, and they'd known her far longer, and not one of them ever saw, not because they couldn't. Because seeing would have cost them a story they'd grown comfortable inside of. And comfort is the most expensive thing there is. Men will pay any price to keep it, will look past any horror, will let a woman be broken in the soft places right in front of them rather than trade in a story that lets them feel like the good and reasonable people of a good and reasonable town. I'm not a good man. I've said it more than once, and I meant it every time. But I'll tell you the one virtue I've got, the only one, and it's not courage and it's not kindness, it's this. I check the numbers. Even when the numbers are inconvenient. Even when everyone around me has agreed on a total that's wrong. I open the book and I count what's actually there. And I've made a hard, cold life out of it, and it's cost me nearly everything. And exactly once it was the only thing in the world that could have saved a woman that a whole town had agreed to let drown. The counting man, they meant it as an insult. I've decided to keep it as a name. I take the bead out sometimes on the bad nights, the ones where the old grief circles close and the column of my life won't come out even no matter how I add it. I hold it up to the fire and I turn it so the white thread catches, and I read her sentence, and I remember a woman who got up out of the mud without hurrying while a town laughed, and who threw the loudest thing her tormentor owned into a wash and said she was tired of listening for it, and who reached out and touched me of her own will exactly one time and made it count for a lifetime. I don't know if she's still up in that country. I hope she is. I hope the walking finally led somewhere. I hope, though I've no right to hope anything on her behalf, that she has bad days now that are only ordinary bad, the kind everybody gets, the kind that don't leave marks in the soft places. But I'll likely never know, and that's the shape of it, and I've made my peace with not knowing the ends of things. The last time I saw her, she was standing in the morning light with her spine straight, watching me ride off, and she lifted one hand, not to wave exactly, just to hold it up, the way you'd hold up a thing you wanted someone to see, the way I'd held up my ledger to her on the road that first day to prove I was different than the rest.